Ladies and gentlemen, last time we talked about Nicholas II, the imperial government, and the problems that it faced at the turn of the century. I pointed out that the regime was a conservative Christian regime, that it had behind it the sanction of laws which made dissent a blasphemy, and it had in its arsenal formidable weapons, formidable punishments that it could mete out to those who were dissidents. I pointed out, however, at the end of the lecture that nevertheless, despite the conservative animating principle of the regime and all of the laws and punishments in the arsenal of the emperor, that there were nevertheless signs, serious signs of discontent in the empire, ethnic discontent and also social antagonisms that attended the building of capitalism in Russia. I want to begin today to address another issue, and that is a kind of a complication that was introduced in Russia in 1905-1906 as a result of the revolutionary events of that period. And that is the introduction of a kind of constitutional system. I want to characterize that constitutional system for you and talk especially about its limitations, because it seems to me that ultimately this constitutional system failed to root democracy and constitutional habits in the Russian body politic. Bear in mind, as we discuss this matter of the genesis and the ultimate failure of the constitutional system, that all the while Nicholas tried hard to keep the empire together by traditional means. The Constitution was, from his point of view, sometimes a distraction, sometimes a necessary evil. His heart and soul were in the use of traditional means of government. And the great paradox of the use of these traditional means of government is that the harder Nicholas used the various tools at his command, the more he pressed Russian nationalism and orthodoxy on the peoples of the empire, the more they resented this Russo-centric attempt by the regime to control their consciences and their destinies. The more he tried to make out of the fabric of backward, if you will, Russia, a great society, a capitalist society, the more money he committed to the building of railroads and factories, the more he attempted to sponsor the growth of the marketplace in Russia, the more social antagonisms that in the context of his society were generated. So the paradox is that a conservative emperor and his conservative policies actually have a revolutionary impact. And it is this underlying dynamic, I think, ultimately that best explains the failure of the traditional policies and perhaps the ultimate failure of the constitutional mechanisms that we are going to be talking about. Now, how did constitutional government, albeit in a limited form, come into existence in the Russian Empire? Amongst intellectuals of a certain stripe, by the turn of the century, it was clear that the old ways of governing simply would not work anymore. This was clear, for example, to the novelist Leo Tolstoy, who was also an influential social thinker with a great following. In 1902, he wrote to Tsar Nicholas II a letter. The letter is amazing for its bravado because it begins with the words, Dragoy brat, dear brother, none of the deference that one might expect from someone looking up to the Tsar, but a complete indication of equality between them. In this letter, a very famous letter, Tolstoy said that the autocracy, the system of government that had worked in Russia for hundreds of years, could no longer work because it was anachronistic. Similarly, the liberal historian and thinker Boris Chicherin wrote in a book called Russia at the Turn of the 20th Century a prophecy that the autocratic system would not last for a long time. And he predicted that in very short order, the regime would have to adopt something like a British system or a system of limited monarchy. So there were very influential intellectuals who had concluded that the death knell of the autocracy was close. Now, I should hasten to point out that even conservatives, for example, someone such as Vasily Kluchevsky, the great historian, who was on intimate terms with some members of the royal family, thought that Nicholas II would be the last autocrat in Russia. So this sentiment was not limited to liberals or radicals. It was something that was more and more widespread amongst educated Russians. Now, from the turn of the century, there were efforts, underground efforts, if you were, semi-official efforts, somehow to build the momentum for a change in the political structure, and indeed for a constitutional development. Some of this took place abroad. For example, in 1902 in Zurich, a newspaper was founded called Liberation. This newspaper published the views of every responsible Russian who wanted a progressive development, that is, reform of the regime, a constitutional change, or even some kind of a social revolution. And it is from this newspaper that called itself Liberation, Osvobождение in Russian, that the term liberation movement came to be applied to those people in Russia itself who were interested in political reform. Now, sometimes we too hastily, let us say, separate in our discussions of history international affairs and domestic affairs. And I want to mention to you something that we cannot neglect, or we neglect at our peril. And that is that in 1904, the government of Russia committed itself to what it hoped would be a short, victorious war over the Japanese. This Russo-Japanese war, it is well known, of course, did not turn out as the regime hoped. Initially, there was a wave of patriotic enthusiasm, the sort of thing that is very common in any society when the government commits it to war. The Japanese were grossly underestimated as opponents of the regime. But when it became clear, which it did within 6 months, that the Russian army was being embarrassed in the field, that it was very difficult to supply troops so far away from the center of the state. When in 1905, the entire Russian Baltic fleet, which had circumnavigated Africa and come to engage the Japanese, when this entire fleet was sunk at the Tsushima Straits, then it became obvious to the Russians that this short, victorious war, so-called, was not perhaps going to be so short, would probably not be victorious. It would be another debacle. This realization accelerated the belief, accelerated the motion, the movement in Russian society toward reform and toward constitutional change. It is a kind of a rule of thumb in Russia that when there is a war that is unpopular, that doesn't go well, that is the time then or shortly thereafter that major changes were undertaken. So let us remember these international complications as we think about the reasons for the constitutional experiment. I mentioned last time the Petersburg labor movement, and I want to say something more about this now, because this is also a major part of the development of constitutionalism in Russia. In the period after the turn of the century, there were various efforts by people in Russian society, but also by the government itself, to channel the resentments of Russian workers in directions that were considered propitious from the point of view of those people. So constitutionalists attempted to harness the energy of workers for the constitutionalist movement. The government, for its part, tried to capture the loyalty of the workers and to use that loyalty for its own ends. And this very complicated situation led to the events of Bloody Sunday in 1905. Let me elaborate. The government, time and again, in Moscow under Police Chief Zubatav, in Petersburg through different agencies, attempted to create what you might call police socialist unions. These were unions that were organized by the government itself. They were permitted the right to assemble. They were permitted the right to discuss their grievances, although this is not a legal matter. It was simply de facto they were permitted this right. And in Petersburg, the tool of the government for organizing workers was a Russian Orthodox priest named Father Gapon. Gapon, however, was a socially committed Christian. He believed that it was possible, really and truly, to address the needs of the workers. And so, at some point in late 1904, early 1905, Gapon, as it were, escaped the control of his masters in the government. He began to see the possibility of organizing a march on the imperial palace itself, and he hoped that at the end of this march he would present, with all due ceremony to the Tsar, a set of petitions which were rationally framed, he thought, and which the Tsar would assent to immediately. Now this was bad calculation on Gapon's part for reasons that we saw last time. The result was the Bloody Sunday massacre, in which, at least by official counts, 200 people were killed, either by shooting from soldiers or trampling in Palace Square. However, the importance of the Gapon events and the Bloody Sunday demonstrations, from our perspective today, that is the point of view of explaining the Constitution, the significance is this. This was a psychological divide. From the point of view of the workers, it was clear that within the framework of the existing regime, their grievances could not be addressed adequately. So one would have to change the structure, the configuration of the government in order for the workers to achieve what they wished. And this pressed workers in Petersburg either into the constitutionalist movement. There was some collaboration with the constitutionalists, but mostly it pressed them in the direction of socialists in the capital, which we'll talk about in a second. Now, over the course of 1905 and 1906, there were various strikes. In October 1905 in Petersburg, there was another big strike, this one a general strike that was led by, not by Gapon, but by social radicals. There was even a council or Soviet that was formed in Petersburg at this point. And these events in Petersburg were mirrored in Moscow. In Moscow there was also, late in 1905, a general strike. And elsewhere in the empire, for example, amongst soldiers who were stretched out all the way along the Trans-Siberian Railroad to Japan, there were here and there soldiers, Soviets, that came into existence. So the term Soviet, which is so important after 1917, has its origination in the developments of 1905. Now, as the regime looked at this unprecedented, from its point of view, situation, these grave difficulties, the advisors of the Tsar said there are only two options. One is dictatorship, and the other is to grant a constitution. Now, the option of dictatorship, as you may have guessed, is something that was perhaps closer to Nicholas' heart than the granting of a constitution. The problem from Nicholas' point of view, in creating a dictatorship, is what would it change? Already in the cities there was martial law, and there had been martial law since 1881. So what would be the difference? I mean, one could close up factories, one could ship, but this would be self-defeating from the point of view of the government. So ultimately, with great hesitation and very much inner reluctance, Nicholas granted the manifesto of October the 17th, 1905, the so-called October Manifesto, a very important document in Russian history. What did it guarantee? It guaranteed first that there would be national elections. It guaranteed that these elections would create in Russia a legislative body of some sort. Now, what the nature of this legislative body and the powers that it would have, this was not spelled out at the time, but a legislative body would be created. And the October Manifesto guaranteed what we would call civil liberties, that is, the right to speak in public, the right to assemble, and so on. Psychologically, having granted this piece of legislation, having made this concession to liberals and revolutionaries, Nicholas felt trapped in a system that was not of his making. It was the making of Russia's enemies, and time again he tries to step over the line that would bring Russia closer to the traditional forms of government that he was familiar with and to whom, which he found the most congenial. Now, in early 1906, the administration issued a set of what are called fundamental laws. These fundamental laws are something like a constitutional charter, but the administration, this is very interesting, chose the term fundamental laws precisely because it avoided the term constitutionalism. They didn't want to say this was a constitution or a constitutional charter. It was simply the fundamental laws of the Russian Empire. But from a comparative perspective, these reforms look like what we would call a constitution. Now, what did they guarantee? They guaranteed for the Tsar considerable powers. What was created was, in effect, a hereditary monarchy which had the powers of a very strong executive or strong presidency. An important aspect of the fundamental laws was the control that it granted the Tsar over the legislature, which was also created under this in 1906. The Tsar had the prerogative to dismiss, whenever he would, the legislature and call for new elections. In the interim between meetings of legislative sessions, the Tsar could govern by decree, although those decrees were subject to review once the new legislature came into session. And then, under Article 87 of the Fundamental Laws, the Prime Minister of the government was granted emergency powers. Now, the Prime Minister was somebody who, under the new structure, would be appointed by the Tsar, and these emergency powers were ill-defined and therefore, in principle, very broad and very arbitrary. So, although a legislature was created, the deck was stacked in the favor of the Tsar and in favor of a continuation of some of his traditional authority. Now, what about the legislature itself? It consisted of two houses. There was an upper house called the State Council. Half of its members were appointed by the Tsar, and half were elected, but from agencies such as the Professoriate or the Academy of Sciences and so on. This was, therefore, in practice, a very conservative body. It was a pliable instrument in the hand of the Tsar. It was something that could be counted on to do his bidding. The lower house of the legislature, called in Russia the Duma, in our terms just the parliament, this lower house or Duma was to be popularly elected. Now what were the electoral formula? Because you know yourself, and historically speaking, that the formula for elections are very important. First of all, there was, in theory, universal male suffrage. So women were not granted the right to vote under this 1906 set of fundamental laws. Then, the most numerous strata of the population, 80% of the people who lived in Russia were peasants or of peasant background. The most numerous strata of the population could vote only indirectly for candidates to the legislature. What happened is that in a given locality, peasants from a region would vote on an elector, somebody who would go to the district level. Then at the district level, another elector would be elected. And finally, after moving through several screens of this sort, a delegate to the State Duma was selected. The idea of this indirect method of election was to diffuse the radicalism that the regime feared was there at the lower levels and to ensure a conservative and pliable Duma. So again, the cards seemingly are stacked in favor of continuity. However, all the best plans of mice and men go astray, and so did Nicholas's. What happened is that this legislative system did not work entirely the way that he hoped it would. The first two Dumas, ones that were elected in 1906 and then in early 1907, were far more radical in terms of the social legislation they espoused than he had hoped. He discovered to his chagrin that both of these Dumas had to be dismissed and new elections held. And after the second dismissal of Duma, the government decided to change the electoral procedures still more so as to guarantee that people of property would be elected in very large numbers. So the third and fourth Dumas, theoretically representing the whole of the Russian people, actually to a much greater degree than the earlier ones represent simply people of property, and in a few cases, social radicals that managed to get through the screens of the electoral formula. In characterizing this system, the great German sociologist Max Weber used the term Scheinkonstitutionalismus. It's a big word. It simply means a pseudo or false constitutionalism. Weber thought that the representation was so unfair and that the elements of continuity with the autocratic regime were so palpable and tangible that one could not really refer to this as a real constitution in the Western European sense at all. Now, let us talk, after this discussion of the origins of the constitutional system, about another complication in its functioning, and that is the relationship that existed between the Tsar as executive, the central administrative part of the government, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the political parties that constituted the bulk of representation in the Dumas. And what I will do, with your permission, is move from the political right to the political left and try to describe the nature of these parties. Now, normally this kind of exercise is mind-numbingly boring, but it's not so boring if you think of each political party as a potential government. In the right circumstances, each of these parties might have governed Russia, and in the actual case, some of them influenced the direction in which the government went. It is important to keep in mind the existence of these political parties because not all of them were communist, by no means. And not all of them were left-wing, by no means. It was not predetermined, it was not in the cards, the historical cards, that Russia would necessarily move from an autocracy to a communist government. So this is the reason that we must attend to the nature of these political parties. Now, the first of them. On the right wing, there were various parties that I have chosen to call ultra-nationalists. These ultra-nationalist parties had various things in common. They were pro-monarchist, first and foremost. They generally were supportive of great Russian ethnic nationalism, secondly. They were sometimes critical of this or that policy of the government, but generally speaking, one can regard them as parties that at their inception were trying to be supportive of the regime under the new constitutional arrangement. Now, the first of these parties that one must name is probably the so-called Union of Russian People. This is a party that was founded in 1905 by a shadowy and ill-understood character named Dr. Dubrovin. Maybe I shouldn't say ill-understood because most of his policies are all too understandable. It's just that we know rather little about his personal life. Dubrovin was not only pro-monarchist and in principle anti-constitutionalist. He was profoundly anti-Semitic. He blamed the Jews of the empire for the Constitution. He blamed them for the misfortunes attending Russians in the western provinces of the empire. He was an able public speaker. He was a kind of a demagogue, in fact, and with his nasty message and his ability to deliver this message, he won a rather large popular following amongst shopkeepers, petty merchants, some workers in the capital. He cheered in October of 1905 when the pogrom swept southern Russia as a reaction against the constitution that Nicholas had just signed, because this constitution was blamed on the Jews. So Dubrovin was cheering violence against Jews. Sad to say, Dubrovin had an audience in the imperial court itself. The future commander of the Russian armed forces in the First World War, the Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, was a supporter of Dubrovin. Nicholas II himself ordered that funds from the Ministry of Internal Affairs be granted to Dubrovin's party, the Union of Russian People, and he briefly wore the insignia of Dr. Dubrovin's Union of Russian People on his arm. Fortunately for the regime, this party was marginal in its influence outside of the circles that I have just named. There was a second ultra-nationalist party, and this one emerged as a greater political force, I think, in the Third Duma. It was a party that for a while the prime minister of the Russian government, Prime Minister Stolypin, attempted to collaborate with and tried to rely upon. It was the so-called Nationalist Party. Now, the Nationalist Party was recruited mainly from the great Russians who were living in the western periphery of the empire. There, the great Russian ethnic group was an ethnic minority. They were surrounded by non-Russian Slavs and by non-Slavs of every variety. And because they were surrounded in what they perceived as a hostile sea, They believed that there had to be the assertion from St. Petersburg of imperial power to protect them against those forces that assailed them. However, this was also a party mostly of property holders, members of the landed gentry, for example. Also members of the Orthodox clergy tended to come to this party. So it was a much more traditional conservative party rather than a radical or proto-fascist party of the sort that Dr. Dubrovin had created in the Union of Russian People. And it was for this reason, I think, because it was a more traditional conservative party, that it had a certain stable following, and it was a party with which the government could make deals during the Third Duma and even the Fourth Duma. Now, in the center of the political spectrum were the pro-constitutionalist parties. There are two of them that are noteworthy. One of them called themselves the Octobrists, or the Union of the 17th of October. They chose that name because the October Manifesto of the 17th, 1905, had granted a constitution, and they believed that this constitution would be the basis for a future political order in Russia that would be stable, that would be democratic and representative, and also would protect property, because this too was a party of property owners. Russia's merchant class, which had emerged by this time in rather greater numbers than some people think. Some people say that the merchantry in Russia was a class that didn't exist. They call it the absent middle class. But in fact, there was a nascent and quite assertive and powerful middle class that was beginning to develop as capitalism developed in Russia in the late 19th and early 20th century. And this was the group of people to whom the Octobrists appealed. And also they appealed to landed gentry, members of the nobility, who believed that their best interest would be served by a constitutional arrangement. There were such people in Russia. Not everyone who had landed property was a reactionary. The other party that is important in our survey of the political parties, a pro-constitutionalist party, was the so-called Constitutional Democrats. Now, they get nicknamed the Cadets because the Russian, the first is a kind of an acronym, KD, Konstitutionные Demokrati, KD, they get called the Cadets for short. These constitutional Democrats had some people of property in their party, but also very many intellectuals. Most of the professoriate, I dare say, belonged to the Constitutional Democratic Party, or at least leaned in that direction. Those recently literate people who comprised the Russian bureaucracy at the provincial level, many of them gravitated toward the Constitutional Democrats, and also experts in the countryside, statisticians, agronomists, doctors, people who worked with the social problems of Russia in the countryside. These people tended to align themselves with the Constitutional Democrats. Now, to a certain extent, the Constitutional Democratic Party was a hybrid. It was a sort of umbrella, and underneath this umbrella, there were two tendencies. The intellectuals, the experts, people who were moved to cooperate with the Constitution because they thought it would be the best way to address the interests, the material interests of the people. These people tended to be radical liberals. They tended to see the possibility of political alliances with the left wing, with the socialist parties, for example. They looked forward to a Russia that would actually not have a monarch at the top. They looked forward to a Russia that would be a pure republic, a democracy in the sense that, say, the French Third Republic was a democracy. The other wing of the constitutional democrats was a rather more moderate and more traditional sort of group. These were liberals who looked at the British Constitution as the model that Russia should follow. They were constitutional monarchists. The difference between them and the Octobrists is that the constitutional democrats had less trust for Nicholas II than did the Octobrists. So that's the fundamental difference. Now let me expand for just a moment on the ideology of the constitutional democrats, because I think it is very important to our understanding of the failure of Russian constitutionalism. In theory, what the constitutional democrats tried to do is to create a broad coalition of Russians and non-Russians in favor of constitutional government or republican government, in favor of civil rights. They tried to create a society of tolerance. They said that their party was above class. And they meant it in this sense, that they weren't partisan in the sense of choosing the interests of the nobility over those of the peasantry. They were trying to find common ground. Underneath the surface, however, most of the members of the Constitutional Democratic Party were statists. That is to say, they believed in a powerful Russian government. And most of them were great Russians in terms of their ethnic background, although there are prominent exceptions. And their problem was this: if Ukrainians, if the Jews, if the Poles, if the other peoples of the empire chose independence, autonomy, chose not to cooperate with their constitutional vision, then scratch a great Russian nationalist and you get a great Russian nationalist answer. They weren't very sympathetic to separatism at all. All right, now let's talk about the left. 80% of those people living in the empire, I said, were peasants. And in theory, the party that spoke for the peasants of the empire were the Socialist Revolutionaries, or SRs. This is a very, very interesting party. It first of all believed that the communal structure in Russia, the way villages were organized, was the basis on which a modern society of egalitarian nature could be built. They described this village commune as the germ of a truly democratic and truly socialist order. And the reason is they felt that all decisions made in the commune were unanimous, that periodically the land that peasants would farm in the commune was redistributed from family to family according to the number of mouths to feed, and that therefore this completely democratic and completely egalitarian structure was the butt of socialism. The only thing that had to be done was to remove the obstacles to its operation. The obstacles were the landed nobility, their control of the land, and also the St. Petersburg bureaucracy. Now, in terms of what the socialist revolutionaries espoused for the long term in Russia, they wanted the land to be socialized. And this meant that land owned by the nobility or the merchantry would be confiscated from them and parceled out amongst the peasants. Nobles or merchants could then join the commune and they could work alongside the peasant. They could, that is, become members of the peasant community, but they would have to share in the toil of the peasant community. So that was the first step. You socialize the land. And the second step was to socialize agricultural production. instead of having an individual household be responsible for this piece of land and that piece of land, they would have a collaborative farming. The peasant commune would parcel out tasks, but not use of land, and everybody would enjoy the fruits of labor. This was a party that was root and branch anti-capitalist. And it was really root and branch, in terms of its theory, a revolutionary party. It could not coexist with the nobility and with the St. Petersburg administration. And therefore, between the socialist revolutionaries who were represented in the first and second and third Dumas, there was great hostility toward the executive, toward the Tsar. I want to point out that inside of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, there was an organization that colored the whole of this period. It was a special group called, in Russian, Boyevaya Organizatsiya, the battle organization, or the fighting organization it's sometimes called. It was a group of terrorists. This was a group of people which was organized clandestinely as an illegal political party within a semi-legal one. It carried out assassinations on high-ranking government officials. In 1904, SRs murdered the Minister of Internal Affairs, Konstantin Pleva, in the middle of Petersburg. In 1905, they murdered the Tsar's uncle, the governor of Moscow, Grand Duke Sergei. In fact, between 1905 and 1914, this was an organization responsible for 9,000 terrorist assassinations aimed at officials in the imperial bureaucracy and various enemies throughout the country. So this was a party that was literally at war with the existing regime. And it's not a wonder that Nicholas felt that he could not collaborate with the SRs. The final party or set of parties I want to say something about is the Social Democrats. I'm going to devote a whole lecture to their ideology, but suffice it to say that they attempted to speak for workers in Russia. And the most important thing about the Social Democrats from the perspective of these last two lectures is this. The Social Democrats tried to harness effectively both sets of resentments that I have talked about. The imperial resentment against the great Russian people, and also the resentments that attend the building of the market society. How did they do this? In theory, this was a party that embraced Marx's slogan from the Communist Manifesto in 1848, "Workers of all countries, unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains." In theory, this was a party that recognized no fatherland for the workers. Therefore, it was a party that would not privilege great Russians over Jews, Poles, Finns, any other nationality. And to the peoples of the empire who had been long suppressed and had all these hostilities toward the central government, that was a very welcome message. The other thing is that, like the SRs, like the socialist revolutionaries, the SDs were an anti-capitalist group. They believed that Russia's future would not be found in capitalism. It would be found in a new form of society that they called socialism. And the nature of this social utopia is something that I am going to be talking about subsequently. So to conclude, the constitutional arrangement in Russia suffered from both ends. It was a bargain broken from both ends. Nicholas II didn't trust the legislature. He preferred traditional means of rule. And the parties, each of them in their own way, had resentments against Nicholas that led to failure to collaborate in a timely fashion, in the case of the cadets and the Octobrists, or in the case of the revolutionary parties, resentments that ideologically precluded any form of collaboration. So the Russian constitutional system, I'm afraid, was doomed by 1914.